The story of Ma Barker doesn't begin with the sound of gunfire. It begins with a whisper, the kind that drifts out of cracked wooden doors on forgotten farmlands, where the wind carries secrets and sorrow in equal measure. Close your eyes for a moment and picture it, a dim dawn light spilling across the dirt roads of Missouri. Roosters cutting through the quiet, and a barefoot girl standing on a porch too small for her dreams and too broken for her future. Her name was Arizona Clark, but the world would one day know her as Ma Barker, the most feared mother in American criminal history. But back then, nobody imagined it. Back then, she was simply another child of the rural South, born into a world where poverty wasn't just a condition, it was a prison. Families fought tooth and nail to fill their cupboards. Children learned early that nothing was given and everything had to be taken. Life didn't offer mercy. And when life doesn't show mercy, people learn to stop showing it back. Arizona was one of those people. She grew up in a house where struggle hung in the air like humidity. The days were long and unforgiving, marked by farm chores, frayed clothes, and the sharp edge of disappointment. Her neighbors said she was strange, too watchful, too sharp, always studying the world like she was preparing for a battle no one else could see. She wasn't cruel, but she was hardened, molded by the roughness around her. And like many in that era, she clung to one dream, escape. But escape doesn't always come the way you expect. For Arizona, it came in the form of a man, George Elias Barker, a broad-shouldered, rough-edged farmhand who offered marriage as a step toward a life that might be better. And she took it, not because she loved him, but because she feared being stuck in the same small corner of nowhere forever. Together, they set out to build a family, settling into a life that would be anything but ordinary. They had 4 sons, Herman, Lloyd, Arthur, known as Doc, and Fred, the Barker boys. Even as toddlers, those boys were wild storms disguised as children. Always fighting, always stealing pieces of the world that didn't belong to them. Apples from neighbors, coins from drawers, small things at first. But that seed of rebellion, that craving for more, grew fast. And Arizona, she didn't stop them. She didn't raise them like most mothers did. She didn't scold them or teach them boundaries. No, she did something much more dangerous. She encouraged them, not openly, not in words spoken aloud, but in her silences, in her smiles when they got away with something, in the way she stood between them and their father's belt. She made excuses, spun lies, covered their tracks, and slowly the Barker boys learned a lesson that would echo throughout the next 2 decades. If you're clever enough, crime pays. As the boys grew older, their small misdemeanors escalated into something darker. Fights became assaults. Petty theft became burglary. Trouble clung to them like smoke. And each time the law came sniffing around, Arizona stood fierce and unmovable, defending them like a mother bear cornered by wolves. People in town whispered about her. They said she spoiled her boys, said she was raising criminals, said something wasn't right about the way she looked at the sheriff like he was the enemy instead of an ally. But they never said it to her face. No one dared, because Arizona wasn't just protective, she was intimidating. The kind of woman whose eyes could silence a room. The kind who seemed to almost enjoy the chaos swirling around her sons, and maybe she did. Maybe the truth is that she found power in power she never had as a poor farm girl. Through her sons, she found a voice loud enough to echo back at the world that once ignored her. Through their bad deeds, she found purpose. Through their defiance, she found identity. While the Barker household spiraled toward lawlessness, the nation outside was changing too. America was stepping into the era of the Great Depression. Jobs vanished. Hunger grew. Desperation turned ordinary people into thieves, and thieves into legends. The criminal world became an underworld of folk heroes. Bonnie and Clyde, John Dillinger, Machine Gun Kelly. And in those shadows, the Barker family found a stage big enough for their ambitions, but before the world knew them as outlaws. They were just a family carved out of hardship, a mother and her sons circling each other like planets spun off axis. Young Fred, the one Arizona always favored, had a charisma that made trouble look charming. Doc had a cold intelligence that gave him an edge in every scheme. Herman was fiery, violent, a powder keg wearing a human face. Lloyd was unpredictable, drifting in and out of prison like he belonged to the walls more than the world. And at the center of them all was Arizona. Now, Ma watching, guiding, shaping them into something far more dangerous than four troubled young men, into a gang, into a family bound not by love, but by crime. Still, when people recall Ma Barker's story, they often imagine a ruthless mastermind from the very beginning. But the truth is more complicated. She didn't set out to build an empire. She simply refused to let the world punish her sons. She refused to let anyone control them. And every step she took to protect them, every lie she told, every cop she challenged, pushed them further down a path with no return by the time newspapers would one day call her the most vicious, dangerous, and resourceful criminal brain of the 1930s. The foundation had already been laid in these early days, in this small Missouri town where rules were made to be broken. And the Barker name began its slow transformation into a national warning. But all of that, the kidnappings, the shootouts, the empire of outlaw fame would come later. For now, the story lives here in the first spark, in a mother who didn't fear darkness because she had grown up inside it, in boys who learned too young that the world only respected those willing to take what they wanted, in a family that looked at the law not as a boundary, but as a challenge. It began with a whisper, but it would end in a roar of thunder that echoed through Ocklawaha, Florida, a roar of gunfire that rattled the bones of a nation, a roar that ensured the name Ma Barker would never be forgotten. And so our journey into the shadows begins. Before she became a figure whispered about in roadhouses and printed in bold black headlines across America, Arizona Ma Barker was just a young woman learning to survive in a world that rarely offered a gentle hand. To understand the storm she later became, we must go back to the soil she grew out of, the dirt roads of Missouri, where life was carved by hunger, grit, and the constant, bone-deep struggle to simply endure. Missouri in the late 1800s wasn't the place of polished landscapes or thriving opportunity. It was harsh, rugged, a land where families were built from sweat and broken by misfortune. Here, the land shaped the people more than the people shaped the land. Winters were unforgiving, summers scorched the skin, and every family lived on the thin line between getting by and falling apart. Arizona. Donnie Clark entered this world in 1873, a child born into a household already weighed down by scarcity. There were no lullabies or soft lessons in her upbringing. Only the cold truths of rural survival. You worked or you starved. You fought or you were forgotten. And no one was going to save you. From a young age, she watched her parents fight against forces too big to overcome. Crop failures, financial instability, and the kind of small-town politics that punished the poor and rewarded the powerful. She saw her mother bend under hard days and her father drown frustration in silence. She saw neighbors gossip, judge, and turn their backs on anyone who slipped even slightly out of line. And she learned something important. If you wanted control in life, you had to take it yourself. Arizona was not born heartless. But the world around her hardened the edges of her innocence early. Poverty does that. It strips away illusions, leaving behind only the blunt reality of what needs to be done. She grew sharp, observant, and fiercely independent. She didn't just see the unfairness around her. She memorized it. Small-town Missouri wasn't a place where dreams flourished. For a girl like Arizona, the future was as predictable as the seasons. Grow up, marry a working man, live in a modest home, raise children, and die with a little more than a fading gravestone as proof you were ever there. But deep down, she despised that script. She craved more, even if she didn't yet know what more was. The Clark family wasn't criminal, but the environment around them bred a familiarity with rule-breaking. Neighbors stole livestock when times got tough. Bar fights were as normal as Sunday service, and lawmen were often corrupt or incompetent. Respect for authority was a luxury few could afford. In a world like this, bending the rules wasn't rebellion. It was survival doc by her teenage years. Arizona had developed a personality that intimidated some and fascinated others. She was bold, outspoken, and unafraid to challenge anyone who crossed her path. In a time when women were expected to be quiet, she refused to shrink. She refused to be dismissed, but strength alone doesn't change destiny. Choices do. And one choice in particular set her life on a course that would eventually shake the nation. She married George Elias Barker. George wasn't wealthy, wasn't powerful, wasn't anything remarkable, just a laborer trying to outrun the same poverty that haunted every man in the community. But to Arizona, he represented escape, however fragile. Marriage meant a chance to create her own life, her own rules, her own identity. But marriage didn't bring peace. It brought responsibility, frustration, and the reality that even away from her childhood home, she was still trapped in the cycle she despised. She still lived in a small house. She still fought to feed her family. And now the future of four sons weighed on her shoulders. Herman, Lloyd, Arthur, Doc, and Fred, the boys who would one day become notorious criminals, legends of the outlaw world. But before that, they were just children shaped by the same unforgiving soil that shaped her. George Barker struggled to provide, but Arizona. She commanded the household with an iron jaw and fiery will. She wasn't abusive, but she was relentless, enforcing loyalty, unity, and a defiance of the world outside their front door. She taught her boys that the law was not to be trusted. That authority was another kind of bully. That survival meant protecting each other at all costs. In the cramped Barker home, trouble became a language spoken fluently. The boys acted out, stealing sweets, fighting other kids, breaking windows, and Arizona defended them every time. She stormed into schoolhouses demanding teachers mind their tone. She confronted neighbors with a glare sharp enough to end arguments before they began. And whenever the sheriff dropped by, she acted offended, outraged, furious that her boys were being targeted, thought it was a dangerous lesson. But she taught it well. The world is against us. So we stand together no matter what you do. Little did she know she was planting seeds that would one day grow into infamous, bloody headlines. Still, for a time, the Barkers were barely a footnote in Missouri life, another struggling family trying its best to get through the days. But the whispers began early. People in town muttered that those Barker boys were a wild pack, that their mother encouraged it, that something wasn't right about the loyalty she demanded from them, to Arizona. These whispers weren't insults. They were warnings. The world was watching, and eventually the world would strike. So she prepared her sons for war against anyone who tried to control them, as the years passed. The Barker home felt less like a family and more like the early blueprint of a gang. Not a gang of criminals, not yet, but a gang of believers. Believers in each other, believers in survival by any means. Believers in the idea that the rules of society didn't apply to them. Arizona's fierce protectiveness soon turned into something more dangerous, validation. She didn't just defend her son's bad behavior, she rationalized it. They weren't wrong. They were misunderstood. They weren't troublemakers. They were outcasts being unfairly judged. She painted the world as an enemy so vividly that her sons began to see themselves as soldiers. And when young men believe they are soldiers in a war that doesn't exist, they go looking for battles. The turning point came when Herman, the eldest, committed his first serious crime. It wasn't childish mischief. It wasn't youthful rebellion. It was theft, a bold one. A crime that forced the sheriff to knock on the Barker door with intent, not suspicion. Most mothers would have cried. Most mothers would have begged forgiveness or pleaded for mercy. Arizona Barker did neither. She squared her shoulders, stared the sheriff down, and made it clear, my boys are innocent. And if you want to blame someone, look elsewhere. The lawmen left frustrated. But the damage was done, in that moment. Her sons learned something that cemented the path they would walk for the rest of their lives. If Ma says we're right, then we're right. And the Barker always said they were right, as small crimes turned into bigger ones. The Barker family reputation began to stain the dirt roads of Missouri. They were trouble. They were dangerous. And most of all, they were untouchable because anyone who went after the Barker boys would have to go through her. Still, Arizona didn't yet see the shape her life was taking. She wasn't trying to create criminals. She was trying to create survivors. She simply didn't realize that the line between the two was razor thin, and eventually, the day would come when her sons stepped into the underworld fully, not as misguided boys, but as outlaws who would leave a bloody trail across America. But that is for the next chapter. For now, picture the dust of Missouri rising under wagon wheels. Picture the tired faces of farmers and mothers and children who lived on hope thinner than paper. Imagine the Barker family at the center of it, not yet infamous, but dangerous in ways no one could predict. Their roots were planted in hardship, their morals warped by survival, their loyalty forged in fire. Out of this ground, legends would grow. And out of those legends came fear. Barker's origin wasn't glamorous, wasn't violent, wasn't dramatic. It was simple, hard, relentless, exactly the kind of beginning that breeds someone unforgettable. If you stand on the dusty roads of Missouri long enough, you start to hear the echoes of footsteps, of boys running wild through empty fields, of laughter sharp enough to cut the quiet. They were the Barker sons, Herman, Lloyd, Doc, and Fred, 4 boys born from the same troubled soil, raised under the watchful, unblinking eye of Ma Barker. And though the world didn't know it yet, these boys would soon carve their names into the darkest corners of American history. But their journey into crime didn't begin with bank vaults or machine guns. No, it began the same way most storms do, quietly, creeping in with small warnings before the downpour. Herman was the oldest. A firebrand from the moment he learned how to stand on 2 feet. He had fists too quick, a temper too short, and a sense of fear so underdeveloped that some swore he didn't possess it at all. He loved the thrill of danger, the rush of rebellion, and the way trouble always seemed to find him like a loyal dog returning home. Lloyd, the second eldest, had a different kind of trouble inside him. He was unpredictable, impulsive, the type who could be calm one minute and erupt the next. He drifted in and out of town fights, minor crimes, and eventually jail cells, as though he was pulled toward destruction by invisible hands. Arthur Doc Barker was smart, too smart. Some said calculating, cold. He wasn't emotional like Herman or reckless like Lloyd. Doc was deliberate, strategic, and frighteningly patient. He didn't just commit crimes, he studied them, perfected them, treated them like puzzles. Only he was clever enough to solve. Then there was Fred, the baby of the family, the one Ma protected most fiercely. He had a charm that could disarm even the angriest soul, a soft-spoken charisma that made people underestimate the darkness forming behind his eyes. Fred wasn't the wildest or the smartest, but he was the most beloved, and sometimes that's the most dangerous kind of boy. Together, the 4 Barker sons were a powder keg waiting for a spark. And in the backdrop of the 1910s and 1920s, when crime blossomed like weeds in the cracks of America's broken economy, sparks were everywhere. Their first steps into the criminal world were almost subtle. Herman stole a bicycle. Lloyd lifted a wallet. Doc broke into a small store, slipping through the back window as if he'd been born for lockpicking. Fred followed their lead with enthusiasm, eager to be part of the reckless brotherhood that was taking shape in the Barker household. Most families tried to hide their sons' misdeeds. But the Barker boys weren't hiding anything. Their crimes became the town's favorite gossip, whispered about in barbershops, muttered over fences, discussed behind closed doors. Those Barker kids are trouble. They'll end up in jail one day. Ma Barker better get control. But Ma didn't want control. She wanted loyalty. And in return, she offered them protection. When the sheriff brought Herman home one night for fighting, Ma stood like a fortress on the front porch. She didn't ask questions. She didn't show fear. Instead, she turned on the sheriff with a glare that could freeze blood. "My boy did nothing wrong," she declared. "He's being targeted, again." It didn't matter that Herman's knuckles were bloody. It didn't matter that the other boy was half conscious. Ma's truth was the only truth her sons ever knew. and with every lie she told to shield them, their confidence grew. Their courage swelled, their boundaries dissolved. The Barker boys began to see themselves not as misfits, but as warriors, outsiders who didn't owe the world anything. And in return, the world owed them even less dot by their teenage years. The Barker sons were no longer mischievous boys. They were budding criminals who tested the limits of what they could get away with. Herman joined the local gang, running with bootleggers and learning the art of intimidation. Lloyd became entangled in violent scuffles, drifting toward the type of men who lived by knives and whiskey. Doc refined his skills in burglary, gaining a reputation for being able to enter and exit a building without leaving so much as a footprint. And Fred soaked it all in, observing, learning. Preparing for the day, he'd take his place among them as an equal, but every path in crime eventually leads to a crossroads. A moment when the small-time mischief transforms into something irreversible. For the Barkers, that moment arrived in a blur of gunpowder and adrenaline. Herman had joined a group planning a robbery across state lines. It wasn't supposed to be violent, just quick money, quick escape. But one mistake, one wrong move, and the job fell apart. Gunshots shattered the night air. 2 men were wounded. Herman fled, vanishing into the dark while the law hunted him like a ghost through the countryside. When he returned home days later, exhausted and trembling, Ma didn't scold him. She didn't tell him he had thrown his life away. She wrapped her arms around him and whispered, "They deserve what they got." And with that single sentence, she sealed the fate of all her sons. From that moment forward, the Barker boys weren't just dabbling in crime. They were committed to it. The thrill was too intoxicating, the danger too addictive, the protection too guaranteed. Dot and Ma Barker, whether she intended to or not, became the emotional engine behind their lawlessness. The boys started traveling with criminals who were older, experienced, deeply entrenched in the underworld. They learned how to case homes, how to crack safes, how to avoid police traps, and how to use violence when necessary. They tasted power, small at first, then greater, and each taste made them hungrier. Doc was the first to be arrested on serious charges. Then Lloyd, then Herman. Each time one of them landed behind bars, Ma showed up in court with a fury that rattled the walls. She argued with sheriffs, cursed prosecutors, and treated every legal setback as a personal attack on her family. To outsiders, she looked like a misguided mother. To her sons, she looked like a hero. To them, Ma wasn't enabling crime, she was fighting against an unfair world. But eventually belief becomes identity, and identity becomes destiny. By the time Prohibition swept across America and crime syndicates flourished like wildfires, the Barker sons were seasoned criminals with reputations stretching beyond Missouri. Their petty crime days were over. Bigger opportunities were calling: bootlegging operations, armed robberies, kidnappings for ransom. The kind of crimes that made headlines, and eventually the kind of crimes that drew the attention of the FBI. The Barker boys weren't just following in the footsteps of criminals who came before them. They were becoming leaders in their own right, dangerous, unpredictable, and fiercely loyal. They weren't yet the notorious Barker-Karpis Gang that would later terrorize the nation. They weren't yet the men surrounded by weapons and wanted posters, but the darkness was forming around them like a cloak, wrapping tighter with each crime, each gunshot, each late-night whisper between brothers. And standing at the center of it all, a small woman with a hard stare and a fearless heart, was Ma Barker, unaware that the children she raised from dust and desperation were evolving into something far bigger, far deadlier than she had ever imagined. The boys weren't just stepping into crime, they were stepping into infamy. There comes a moment in every outlaw's life when the line between who they were and who they become disappears completely. For the Barker family, that moment was not a single event, not one bullet or one crime or one escape. It was a transformation that happened slowly, quietly, like a shadow stretching across a room until there is no light left. And at the center of that shadow, no longer just a mother, but something far more fearsome, stood Ma Barker. To understand how she became the matriarch of Mayhem, a title that newspapers would one day splash across front pages. You must picture her not as a villain from the start, but as a woman reshaped by choices, hardship, and unbreakable loyalty. Her sons had stepped into crime like boys testing the limits of a dark forest. But Arizona Ma Barker? She walked into it willingly, keeping pace with the danger like she was meant to be there. It didn't happen overnight. It began with her fierce protectiveness, the same kind she showed when the boys were young. But now, instead of defending them from schoolyard accusations, she defended them from the law. Instead of denying broken windows, she denied robberies. Instead of hiding stolen apples, she hid fugitives, her own flesh and blood. The Barker house became a revolving door of her son's crimes. One week, Lloyd was hiding out after a brawl. The next, Herman returned from a robbery gone wrong. Then Doc would show up with stolen goods, acting as though he owned the world. And Fred, sweet-faced, always loyal Fred, stayed close to his mother, learning from her the one skill that would define him, how to justify any sin if you tell yourself. It was necessary. Most mothers would beg their sons to stop. But Ma didn't. She justified their actions. She encouraged their defiance. She fed their hatred of authority, and with each word she offered in their defense. She became part of the criminal world in ways even she didn't fully grasp. But by the early 1920s, her sons were no longer just rebellious young men. They were wanted criminals with records that stretched from petty theft to armed robbery. One by one, they were arrested and sent off to prison in different corners of the country. The Barker family was fracturing, scattered, divided, and here, in this moment of separation, something shifted in Ma. Most broke mothers would have grieved. Most would have collapsed under the weight of shame, but not Arizona Barker. She traveled to whichever prison one of her boys was held. She visited tirelessly, bringing them news, comfort, and the same unwavering confidence that they were simply victims of a cruel world. Other inmates watched her walk through the metal gates like she was entering a neighbor's home. She didn't show fear. She didn't show weakness. She acted like the prison belonged to her, as though the guards were merely inconveniences standing in her way. Her sons clung to her devotion like lifelines, and Ma clung to them like anchors that kept her identity from drifting into obscurity. When Herman escaped custody, he returned directly to his mother's embrace. When Doc planned his next move, he called for her opinion. When Lloyd needed help after being caught in a violent dispute, she came without hesitation. And Fred, the youngest, grew to depend on her so deeply that by the time he became a full-fledged criminal, he couldn't imagine a life or a crime without his mother by his side. Gradually, rumors began to swirl. Neighbors whispered, "She's encouraging them. She's part of their crimes. She's the brains behind the boys." And even though some of that was speculation, a mixture of fear, prejudice, and gossip, there's one undeniable truth. The Barker boys were dangerous when they were alone, but they were unstoppable when Ma was with them. Her presence emboldened them. Her confidence fueled them. Her unwavering loyalty gave them a sense of invincibility. It wasn't long before the criminal world began to take notice when Fred formed an alliance with Alvin Karpis, the man who would one day be known as America's Most Wanted. Ma was there, not committing the crimes, not pulling the triggers, but watching, advising, and becoming the emotional glue that bound the growing gang together. The Barker-Karpis Gang wasn't yet infamous, but it was emerging slowly, ruthlessly, like a monster assembling its limbs, and Ma was becoming its spine. The deeper the gang sank into their outlaw lifestyle, the more they relied on her home for shelter. Ma provided safe houses. She handled logistics. She served meals to fugitives like they were guests at a family reunion. Detectives later reported that her presence created an atmosphere of unity, unlike anything they'd seen among criminals. They joked in her presence, relaxed, planned, and she listened, quietly, intently, offering advice when needed. To the gang. She was Ma. To law enforcement, she was the most dangerous mother in America. And to herself, she was finally powerful after a lifetime of being overlooked. First as a poor girl, then as a poor wife. She had found a role that made men fear her, respect her, depend on her. She became the backbone of outlaws who terrorized cities and small towns alike. Her son saw her not just as a parent, but as a symbol, a protector, a strategist, a shield. Some even say she reveled in it. That she enjoyed sitting in the living room while her boys counted stolen cash on the table. That she smiled when they described robberies, as though the thrill belonged to her as much as to them. And maybe it did, because by the time the Barker boys reached their peak, Barker wasn't just part of their crimes. She was part of their identity. Then came the kidnappings. The Barker-Karpis gang moved from robberies to high value. Ransom operations, grabbing wealthy businessmen, terrifying cities, and earning payouts so large they rattled the FBI into action. These weren't small schemes anymore. They were national headlines. Crimes that reshaped the landscape of American law enforcement. And though Ma didn't plan these kidnappings, she was there, always there, in hideouts, in safe houses, in cabins deep in the woods. Her presence became so central, so unavoidable, that FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover himself would later declare her the most dangerous mastermind behind the Barker gang. Was it true? Or was it a narrative created to justify what would soon happen in Florida? History still debates that. But in the eyes of the public, in the eyes of the nation, Ma Barker had become something new. A legendary outlaw matriarch. A criminal icon. A symbol of the American underworld. And as the Barker Empire expanded, so did the myth of the woman who held it all together, yet with every crime, every escape, every newspaper headline. The noose tightened. The law was closing in. The FBI was evolving. The nation was changing, and the Barker family was headed straight toward an ending, drenched in gunfire. But for now, Ma Barker stood at the height of her influence, a woman who had risen from poverty to become the mother of one of the most feared gangs in America. She was no longer just a mother. She was the matriarch of mayhem. And the world would remember her, even if the truth behind her legend was far more complicated than anyone realized. In the quiet after the storm, the smoke cleared, the guns fell silent, and the bodies were carried away. America was left with a haunting question. Who was Ma Barker, really? Was she the ruthless criminal mastermind the FBI painted her to be? Or was she something more complicated? Something more tragic? Her legacy didn't settle neatly into one box, because legends never do. They sprawl out into conflicting stories, whispered rumors, courtroom testimonies, family memories, and official reports, each one twisting the truth just a little more until the woman behind the myth becomes harder and harder to see in the days following the Florida siege. The newspapers wasted no time crafting an iconic villain. Headlines screamed about Bloody Ma, the heartless matriarch who raised a brood of killers and stood beside them to her death. The photographs released of the tiny lakeside home bullet-riddled walls, shattered windows, overturned furniture, were splashed across front pages nationwide. To the public, it was the perfect story. A gangster mother shot down in a final blaze of glory, refusing to surrender, firing at federal agents until her last breath. It had drama, violence, rebellion, everything a sensational tale needed. But beneath the sensationalism lay the messier truth. For the Barker boys, though still alive, their mother's death carved a wound that never closed. Though they were criminals by every definition, they were also sons who remembered a woman who cleaned their shirts, cooked their meals, scolded them when they broke curfew, and told them she loved them before they stepped out the door. In their memories, she wasn't a mastermind orchestrating robberies and kidnappings from behind the curtains. She was a mother who couldn't say no, a woman who raised her family with fierce loyalty and blind devotion that ultimately dragged her into their crimes and sealed her fate. Beside them, and that was the part America struggled to DERST Andy J. Edgar Hoover, eager to prove the FBI's growing power, insisted she was the brains of the operation. The official narrative portrayed her as a calculating tactician, the matriarch who engineered escapes, planned heists, and manipulated her sons like pawns on a board. It made the Bureau look heroic, their victory monumental. After all, defeating a criminal empire led by a brilliant mastermind carried more weight than taking down a mother who simply followed her children from hideout to hideout. But decades later, historians, criminologists, and even some FBI agents would quietly suggest that maybe, just maybe, Hoover's story had been exaggerated. Maybe it served a greater purpose and accuracy wasn't the top priority. Because when the evidence was examined closely, the picture didn't quite match the legend. Ma Barker couldn't read or write beyond the bare basics. She had no record of organizing heists or giving strategic orders. Her so-called gangster notebooks, once praised as proof of her criminal genius, were later revealed to be nothing more than grocery lists and scattered household reminders. She wasn't the one scouting banks or plotting getaways. She wasn't negotiating ransoms or dividing profits. What she did do was travel with her sons, cook their meals, keep house, and look the other way when they came home with blood on their clothes and money they couldn't possibly have earned legitimately. To some, that still made her guilty. To others, it made her tragic. Because what happens when a mother loves her children so fiercely that she loses herself in the shadows they cast? What happens when loyalty becomes a curse, when affection becomes a chain, when the instinct to protect becomes the very thing that destroys? Ma Barker's legacy split down those lines. In a criminal underworld. She became a loyalty misguided, reckless, unconditional loyalty, but loyalty nonetheless. Her story became a cautionary tale whispered in prison cells, smoky backrooms, and dimly lit bars where men traded stories about fallen legends. They said her mistake wasn't crime. It was choosing family over freedom. She kept the boys close, even when letting them go might have saved her life. In the public imagination, Ma Barker transformed into an almost mythical figure. Films portrayed her as a snarling mastermind, a wicked puppet master controlling her sons with cold determination. Songs and novels reimagined her as a she-wolf of the underworld, a woman who reveled in violence. None of it was quite accurate, but accuracy was never the point. The myth was more exciting than the truth, and yet, in the quiet spaces between the myths, another version of her story began to emerge, one told by women who recognized something familiar in her desperation, something human in her bad decisions. They saw a woman trapped by circumstance, poverty, and loyalty. A woman who clung to family because she had nothing else. A woman whose love became her undoing. Her legacy didn't exist in clean lines. It sprawled, tangled, contradictory. Like the life she lived. The house in Auklawa eventually became a grim tourist attraction. Visitors walked through its reconstructed walls, peered at bullet holes, stared at faded photographs, and tried to imagine the chaos of that final gunfight. Some came seeking thrill, others came seeking truth. But the truth was slippery. It changed depending on who was telling the story. BFB, I said, she died with a machine gun in her hands, fighting to the last second. Some eyewitnesses claimed she never fired a shot. Some claimed she begged the agents to let them surrender. Others insisted she shouted curses from the windows, defiant to the end. The real details dissolved in the smoke of memory, leaving behind only the echoes of the legend. But maybe that's how it's supposed to be. Maybe some stories are meant to remain half shadow, half like glimpses of the truth wrapped inside the illusions we create to explain the world around us. Because Ma Barker's story is not just about crime. It's about motherhood twisted by circumstance. It's about loyalty stretched to its breaking point. It's about a country grappling with the rise of organized crime and the birth of federal power. It's about a woman who became an icon, even if the icon didn't resemble the real person at all. In the end, the lessons her story offers are not simple. They're not moralistic or tidy. But they linger, Loyalty can be a virtue until it isn't. Love can protect until it destroys. Family can save you. And family can bury you. Ma Barker's final legacy is this, a reminder that even in the darkest corners of crime, humanity flickers, that villains and heroes often wear the same faces, and that sometimes the greatest tragedies are born not from malice, but from love. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe for more tales from the shadows of history. Night fell differently over America once the Barker-Karpis Gang became a national obsession. Rumors traveled quicker than the newspapers, and fear spread faster than the law could keep up. Farmers whispered about strange cars on lonely roads. Hotel clerks memorized faces and license plates. And every sheriff from Missouri to Minnesota claimed at least once that they'd spotted one of the Barker boys lurking in their town. The nation was on edge, and somewhere in that swelling tide of tension, the Barker family felt the walls closing in. But the tightening of the net didn't happen suddenly. It crept in slowly, like a cold draft slipping beneath a locked door. After the Kansas City massacre, after the kidnappings that made headlines coast to coast, the Barker gang had become more than criminals. They were symbols. And symbols attract attention. J. Edgar Hoover, hungry to elevate the FBI into America's elite force, pushed his agents harder than ever before. He needed a victory, a big one that would cement the Bureau's authority in the eyes of the public. And the Barker-Karpis Gang, chaotic, violent, unpredictable, became the perfect target. Every misstep, every stray whisper, every careless decision added weight to the closing trap. It began with a letter, a simple, mundane letter that Arthur Doc Barker mailed from Chicago to a woman he trusted. A woman he shouldn't have trusted. The FBI had been watching her quietly for months, believing she held the key to the Barker boys' whereabouts. The letter was intercepted, examined, photographed. Copies passed from desk to desk until one agent noticed something. Doc's handwriting mentioned a safe house in Florida. A lake, a cottage, a place where things were quiet. Things were safe. Safe? To the Barker family, perhaps. To the FBI, it was a crack in the armor. From that moment on, the Bureau's relentless hunt grew fangs. Federal agents moved with patience and lethal precision. They mapped out the surrounding towns, interviewed store owners, followed the trail of suspicious purchases, large orders of canned goods, ammunition, fuel. Even the mundane details told a story, and the story pointed south. Meanwhile, Ma Barker simmered with a strange mix of pride and fear. She'd always been the caretaker, the one keeping the boys close, the one who made their hideouts feel like home. But now she felt the pressure building. She heard the whisper of tires on gravel, the rustle of branches outside at night, the distant hum of aircraft passing overhead. She told the boys not to worry, but inside she knew the world was changing. Nerves were fraying. Mistakes were being made, and the FBI was waiting for just one more mistake. That mistake came in the form of Hubert Red Youngblood, a fugitive whose loyalty didn't match his desperation. When agents cornered him in St. Paul during a routine sweep, he cracked under pressure. Maybe it was fear of the chair. Maybe it was the promise of leniency. Maybe it was simply human nature, but he talked. And what he said matched the letter Doc had carelessly mailed. Florida, Lake Weir, a rented property. 2 Barkers inside. Doc wasn't there, but Ma and Fred were. That was enough. In the FBI's Jacksonville office. Hoover's orders came down with the weight of a hammer strike. Locate the house, surround it, and bring them down. The Bureau's moment had come, and they intended to seize it, but the Barkers didn't know any of this. Not yet. At the lake house, Ma tried to keep life normal. She made breakfast the way she always did. Eggs, ham, thick slices of bread, toasted on an iron pan. Fred smoked on the porch, pacing with restless movements, tapping his foot, checking the horizon as if expecting something to appear. He felt it too. That prickling sense of danger. The lake was beautiful, but beauty could be a veil. And under that veil, something deadly was moving toward them. The days grew quieter, the neighbors more watchful, and one man, observant fisherman, noticed something odd. a woman at the cottage who seemed out of place. Her mannerisms were sharp, suspicious, always scanning, always wary. He mentioned it casually to a friend at the sheriff's office. That comment traveled farther than he ever imagined got by the time the FBI received the tip. They already had the letter and Youngblood's testimony. Now they had confirmation. A triangulation of small clues that painted one unmistakable picture. Ma Barker and her favorite son, Fred, were holed up at Lake Weir. The trap was set, but life inside the cottage continued with eerie normality. Ma played card games. Fred cleaned his guns. They listened to the radio crackle with distant news reports of bank robberies and political scandals. To them, the world outside seemed far away. Until the night the dogs began barking. Until Fred heard footsteps on the gravel road. Until a shadow passed by the window just for a moment, barely noticeable. Fred asked his mother if she'd seen anything. She said no. But she didn't sound confident. Both of them sensed what neither wanted to admit. The calm around them felt staged, artificial. Like the quiet before lightning splits the sky. Fred didn't sleep much that night. He sat by the window with his weapon leaned against his leg, watching the darkness breathe. Ma lay in the small bedroom, hands folded over her chest, murmuring prayers she hadn't spoken since her childhood at dawn. The agents arrived, dozens of them, armed, silent, methodical. They moved like a tide, surrounding the cottage from every angle. The order was clear. No one gets out. The Barkers had evaded law enforcement for years, but the Bureau was determined that this time it would end here. What Fred and Ma didn't know, what they couldn't know, was that the entire world was watching. Even before the first shot was fired, reporters hovered in nearby towns, eager for a story. Radio stations buzzed with updates. The FBI, for all its secrecy, had let slip that something big was about to happen. The hunt was no longer just a manhunt. It was theater, a showdown, a final act building toward its crescendo. As the sun began to rise over Lake Weir, the agents took their positions, fingers tightening around triggers, eyes sharp and unblinking. The air was thick with anticipation. Inside the house, Ma stirred. Fred rose from his chair. A strange silence, pressed against the walls, so heavy it almost felt alive. Then came the voice through the bullhorn clear, commanding, echoing across the water. Federal Bureau of Investigation. Come out with your hands up. Everything froze. This was the moment where all paths converged. The crimes. The chases, the escapes, the loyalty, the choices. The moment where fate demanded its due. The net had tightened and the Barkers were caught inside. In the seconds after the bullhorn's command shattered the stillness of dawn, time seemed to stretch like taffy. Inside the lakeside cottage, Ma Barker and her son stood, frozen two silhouettes trapped in a moment that felt both unreal and inevitable. Fred Barker's hand hovered near his weapon, breath tightening, eyes darting from the door to the windows as though one might suddenly offer escape. Ma's heartbeat thudded in her chest with the heavy rhythm of someone whose life had just changed in an instant. Outside, the agents were statues among the trees, rifles drawn, faces hard, boots planted in the soft Florida sand. A thin mist rolled off Lake Weir, drifting low along the ground like a pale ghost weaving through the undergrowth. Birds that had been chattering a moment earlier scattered into the sky, startled by the echo of already. Even nature seemed to fall silent, as if waiting to see how the next heartbeat would unfold. Fred whispered sharply, "Ma, get down now." His voice trembled, not with fear, but with adrenaline, the kind that claws deep under the skin and sets every nerve on fire. He knew what was coming. He'd lived too long on the run not to recognize the tone of a siege. The FBI wasn't asking for surrender. They were setting a stage. They wanted a show. They wanted a victory they could parade in the headlines. Ma, however, didn't sink to the floor like he asked. She stood, stoic and worn, her hands trembling only slightly as she steadied herself on a table. Her gray hair still in loose curls from the night before. Framed a face etched with years of exhaustion, loyalty, and the haunting weight of every choice she had ever made. "Fred," she murmured in a shaky breath, "don't do anything foolish. But Fred was past the point of retreat. Something in him had snapped not into panic, but into resolve. The world had hunted them for too long. He had no intention of walking out to be paraded in shackles, to be a trophy delivered to Hoover's desk from outside. The voice returned, louder this time, echoing with finality. This is your last warning. Surrender now. The words rolled across the lake, bounced off distant trees, and seeped into the walls of the cottage like poison. Fred made the first move. With a swift motion, he dove toward the window, raising his rifle. He peered through a thin gap in the curtain, eyes narrowing at the cluster of agents positioned beyond the tree line. He didn't wait for Ma to protest. He didn't think of consequences. He simply pulled the trigger. The gunshot cracked the morning. Air like a lightning bolt splitting the sky. The first shot didn't hit anyone, but it didn't need to. It was the spark thrown into a dry forest, and the fire erupted instantly. The FBI returned fire with brutal precision. Bullets tore through the cottage walls, splintering wood, cracking glass, shredding curtains, and sending fragments flying like deadly confetti. The once peaceful lakeside retreat transformed into a war zone within seconds. Inside, Ma dropped to the floor at last, throwing her arms over her head as debris rained around her. Dust clouded the air. The walls groaned under the assault. The smell of gunpowder swallowed the room, sharp and metallic. Fred crouched behind an overturned table, firing back in short, sharp bursts. His movements were frantic yet practiced. He'd survived dozens of shootouts, but none like this. This wasn't an ambush. This was a siege, a final stand. And deep down, he knew it. Hold on, Ma. He shouted through the roar of gunfire. Just stay low. His words were drowned out by another volley of bullets. Outside, the FBI agents moved in formation, spreading out to encircle the property completely. Some took positions behind trees. Others crouched behind parked cars. A few moved closer, ducking low and shouting instructions to each other over the deafening exchanges. Inside the cottage, every second felt like a lifetime. The walls shook. Lamps toppled. A shelf collapsed, spilling dishes and knickknacks across the floor. But amid the chaos, Ma Barker didn't scream. She didn't panic. She pressed herself flat, breathing in shallow gasps, trying to make sense of what her life had become. She thought of her boys, Herman, Lloyd, Arthur, Fred, each one swallowed by the violence of the world they'd chosen. She remembered days long before the gang, before the crimes, before the FBI. Days when they were small, when they laughed, when they came home covered in dust instead of blood. She remembered holding them, scolding them, feeding them, loving them. She never imagined she'd die beside them in a storm of bullets. Fred kept firing until the smoke from his rifle stung his eyes. He reloaded with shaking hands. Sweat trickled down his neck. He could feel the heat of the firefight growing, closing in, suffocating. Then suddenly, briefly, impossibly, the gunfire ceased. A moment of eerie silence swept over the cottage. Fred lowered his rifle slightly, eyes narrowing. Fred Barker. A voice thundered from outside. This is your final chance. Come out with your hands in the air. Do it now, or we'll end this by force. Fred wiped his forehead with the back of his sleeve. His chest rose and fell rapidly. He glanced over at his mother, who looked back at him with tired, helpless eyes. He knew what she was thinking. He knew what she was asking without saying a word. He also knew he couldn't give it to her. Ma. He whispered, voice cracking. I'm not walking out of here. She closed her eyes for a long moment, as if grieving him before he died. The silence outside stretched thin. Fred's jaw tightened. And then we go together. The FBI, realizing the standoff would not end peacefully, resumed fire. This time with heavier rounds, more deliberate, more destructive. Bullets punched through the cottage with terrifying force. Chunks of plaster exploded. The floor trembled as though the house itself was crying out under the assault. Fred scrambled to the back window and returned fire, hitting a tree trunk inches from an agent's shoulder. Men dove behind cover, shouting to reposition. It was chaos, a deadly ballet between outlaws and the law. Performed under the rising Florida sun dot inside, Ma felt something shift in the floor beneath her. The cottage wasn't built for war. Each bullet carved away at its skeleton, exposing beams, ripping through furniture, cracking the stone fireplace. Smoke filtered through the rooms, mixing with dust until everything tasted like ash. Fred moved like a man possessed, running from room to room, firing through shattered windows, yelling curses at the agents, daring them to push closer. He wasn't fighting to escape, he was fighting because he refused to surrender. Fighting because this was all he had left, but the agents kept advancing. A team moved along the left flank, ducking behind trees, inching toward the cottage's blind spot. Another group provided cover fire. A sniper settled into position on a nearby hill, eyes trained through his scope. Hours passed. Hours of bullets. Hours of smoke. Hours of a battle that should have ended in minutes. But the Barkers held. They held because Fred refused to stop. They held because Ma, despite her age and fear, stayed by his side. They held because fate had carved this ending long before the first shot was fired. Eventually, the sun climbed high enough to cast the battlefield in harsh light. The agents wiped sweat from their brows. Their ammunition supplies were dwindling. Their patience thinning. Their orders unchanging. Bring them down. Inside. Fred's rifle clicked empty. He reached for another magazine and found none. His stash was nearly gone. Smoke burned his lungs. His arm throbbed where a bullet had grazed him. His strength waned. Still, he turned toward his mother. Ma, it won't be long now. Her eyes glistened, not with fear, but with sorrow. Deep, ancient sorrow. Outside, the FBI prepared for their final push. The siege was nearing its end. But the last chapter had yet to be written. The sun had climbed high enough that its light glared against the shattered windows of the cottage, turning jagged pieces of broken glass into scattered diamonds. The Florida air was thick, heavy with humidity and gunpowder, a suffocating mixture that clung to the skin and throat of anyone close enough to breathe it. Hours had dragged on, each one marked by bursts of gunfire, shouted commands ricocheting bullets, and the groaning collapse of a house that had never been built to withstand a war. Inside that collapsing shelter, Fred Barker was beginning to fade. Smoke curled from the walls, drifting in ghostly tendrils. The floors creaked under the abuse, dust falling in soft clouds with each fresh impact. Fred's chest rose and fell rapidly as he scrunched down behind an overturned table, his chosen cover. Though by now it was more of splinters than wood. His shirt clung to him, wet with sweat and streaked with blood from a bullet that had grazed his shoulder. Earlier in the fight, his breath rattled in his lungs. And for the first time that morning, he felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel since the siege began, the creeping, slithering approach of hopelessness. He wiped his brow with a shaky hand and peered through a bullet hole in the wall. The agents were closing in. He could see them now, fleet silhouettes darting from tree to tree, tightening the circle, moving with relentless precision. Their faces were set like stone. They weren't here for arrests anymore. They weren't here for negotiations. They were here for an ending. Ma Barker lay nearby, her frail body pressed against the floorboards. She'd stopped flinching at the sound of gunfire. She'd stopped ducking every time a bullet tore through a wall. She'd surrendered herself not to the FBI outside, but to the truth. This was where her story and her son's story would end. Her eyes, though filled with dust and tears, held a strange kind of peace. A peace that didn't come from acceptance, but from exhaustion. A lifetime of lifting her sons, shielding them, enabling them, protecting them, loving them, even when that love led them into darkness, had culminated in this very moment. But a mother does not abandon her child. Not even at the gates of death. Fred. Her voice was a whisper, almost lost in the roar of the continuing siege. Calm down, honey. Stay with me. Don't go to that window again. He turned toward her, his face streaked with soot and desperation. Ma, they ain't talking us alive. His voice cracked, each word heavy with certainty. You know that? She looked at him with trembling lips, her face lined with fear, regret, and something deeper love, so fierce it bordered on agony. I know, she said at last. But I don't want to see you get torn apart. Fred wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, refusing to let the tears fall. He'd spent his life being the wild one, the fearless one, the reckless storm of the Barker clan. But here, in this tiny cottage, with death pounding on every wall, he looked less like a gangster and more like the little boy Ma once carried on her hip. Another volley of bullets struck the house, sending shards of wood and plaster raining over them. Fred grabbed his rifle again, but when he pulled the trigger, it clicked empty. The sharp, metallic sound echoed like a death bell. He tossed the useless weapon aside and reached for a handgun near the sofa. His fingers trembled, the exhaustion settling deep in his bones. But he wasn't ready to surrender. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Outside, the agents had regrouped. Their captain shouted orders. Advance. Get to the front porch. Keep low. Keep firing. The agents began to close in like wolves in a coordinated hunt. Fred ducked as a bullet tore through the wall inches above his head. He fired his pistol toward the movement outside, the recoil jolting through his battered arm. The gun barked 3 times before he scrambled back behind the table. 3 shots. 3 desperate cries into a storm that refused to break. Ma crawled toward him, dragging herself across the broken wood and debris. When she reached him, she placed a trembling hand on his ankle. Please, Fred. Please sit with me. Don't stand up again. Don't let them shoot you while you're fighting. Her plea was raw, human, heartbreaking. Fred looked down at her, his chest tightening with something far heavier than fear. He slid across the floor until he sat beside her, backs pressed together against the crumbling wall. For a moment, a rare, fleeting moment, they rested. The gunfire slowed. The shouting softened. Even the lake outside seemed to hold its breath. Fred closed his eyes. He could feel the house shuddering, feel his own heartbeat pounding against cracked ribs, feel his mother's head rest lightly against his shoulder. And for that single, fragile heartbeat of silence, time softened, but silence is a liar in a gunfight. A sudden blast shattered the stillness. Agents fired again, harder, faster, more determined than ever. The walls groaned under the assault. Plaster rained from the ceiling. A bullet whizzed so close to Fred's head that it parted a strand of his hair. He turned to Ma, panicked. I'm out of ammo. Ma. His voice cracked with a mix of terror and resignation. I got nothing left. She reached up, cupping his cheek with a shaking hand. Dust coated her fingers, but her touch was gentle, warm. The touch of a mother? The touch of home. Then don't fight anymore, she murmured. Just stay with me. Fred's eyes glistened. I ain't letting them take you. She didn't answer. Some truths didn't need words. Outside, the captain shouted, Surround the house. They're running out. Running out, the words echoed through Fred's mind. Running out of all. Running out of time. Running out of breath. Running out of life. He gripped his mother's hand tighter, and then it happened. A single shot, louder than any that came before, ripped through the cottage like a thunderclap from hell. Its trajectory was perfect, its impact immediate. Fred jerked violently. His breath punched from his lungs. His body collapsed sideways, landing across his mother's lap. His eyes twitched, staring at nothing. The pistol slipped from his hand and skittered across the floor. Ma let out a gasp, a sound so raw, so full of anguish that even the agents outside heard it through the walls. Fred. Her scream tore through the siege. She clutched him, her hands trembling, pulling his limp body close. Blood seeped beneath him, spreading across the floorboards. Her fingers brushed his hair, smoothing it like she used to when he was a child. Gunfire erupted again as the FBI assumed the fight continued. Unaware that the cottage had already lost its strongest defender, Ma didn't move, didn't run, didn't duck. She pressed her forehead to Fred's and whispered broken words into the smoky air. It's okay, baby. It's okay. I'm right here. I ain't leaving you. Tears streamed down her face. A final bullet, no one knows who's found her. It struck her just below the ribs. Her breath hitched, and she slumped over Fred. Their bodies intertwined, mother and son held together by death as fiercely as they had been by life. Outside, the agents fired until the house fell silent, completely silent. Smoke drifted out of broken windows. The walls sagged inward, and for the first time since dawn, no sound came from within. The captain raised his hand. Ceasefire. Agents approached cautiously, rifles drawn, boots crunching on glass and debris. They kicked the door open, swept through the ruined home in tight formation. What they found froze them in place. Ma, Barker, and Fred lay together on the floor, bodies riddled. Hands still clasped. The siege of Lake Weir was over. The outlaws were no more. And the legend of Ma Barker was born in that instant, not through victory, but through tragedy. The hours before the storm always carry a strange quiet, an unnatural stillness that makes the world feel like it's holding its breath. On that January morning in 1935, deep in the quiet backroads of Ocklawaha, Florida, Ma Barker had no idea the world was about to exhale its deadliest breath on her doorstep. Inside the small lakeside house. Her boys were still half asleep, scattered across couches and worn beds, their guns resting within arm's reach like loyal dogs. The wooden floor creaked with the soft rhythm of movement, someone shifting in a blanket, someone turning over, someone mumbling in their sleep. These were the last soft sounds of their lives before the thunder arrived. Outside, hidden behind trees, brush, and the shadows of dawn, the FBI had already surrounded the place. For them, this wasn't just another operation. It was the moment they had been chasing for years. The Barker-Karpis Gang had humiliated them, outplayed them, escaped them time and time again. And now they were ready to crush the legend once and for all. But inside the house, Ma Barker still believed she had time. She always believed she had time. She was up before the others, sipping weak coffee from a chipped mug as she looked out at the lake. The fog hung low, hugging the water like a ghostly blanket, blurring the line between water and sky. Ma liked mornings like this. They made her feel invisible. Age had softened her in ways her boys never noticed. Her hands were thinner, her eyes a little dimmer, her shoulders slightly rounded from years of carrying a family she never quite got to rest from. But she still carried the same iron inside, the same will that had built a dynasty out of desperation and bad choices. She set her mug down. Something fell off, not a sound, not even a bird, too quiet. She stepped closer to the window, narrowing her eyes as the fog shifted. For a second, she thought she saw movement, just a faint outline slipping behind a tree. Then another. Her breath stopped. No. Not now. She turned away, her heart pounding in her chest. Fred, she hissed under her breath. Wake up. Fred Barker didn't wake easily. He'd been up late polishing his guns, mumbling about the past, about glory days, about how no one could pin him down. He was reckless like that? A dreamer with a gun in his hand. She shook him harder. Fred, get up, now. His eyes snapped open, and before he even asked, he knew. It was the same instinct that had kept them alive through a dozen shootouts and 24 close escapes. He sat up, grabbed his gun, and whispered, Ma. What did you see? Her answer was a single, trembling inhale. Fred was on his feet instantly. The old house seemed to come alive with tension as he rushed from room to room, waking the boys. Get up. It's the feds. They found us. In seconds, the sleepy quiet transformed into chaos, guns clattering, boots hitting the floor, windows checked, doors bolted. The Barker boys had done this dance long enough to know each step by heart. Meanwhile, the fog outside began to thicken as the FBI agents took their positions. The order was clear. Take them alive if possible. Take them dead if necessary. The leader raised his hand. Surround the house. They're not getting out. Inside, Fred slammed a fresh magazine into his Thompson and peeked through the blinds. Dozens of shadows. Dozens of rifles. Dozens of men closing in. His jaw tightened. They think they got us trapped, he whispered. Ma Barker put a hand on his arm steady. Firm, the way she always did when fear threatened to swallow him whole. No. Son, she said, we ain't trapped. We've been here before. He looked at her, waiting for the rest, waiting for the plan, the escape route. The miracle she always seemed to pull out of thin air. But this time, her eyes didn't hold the same spark. She saw it too. This wasn't just another stand. This was the stand. Fred swallowed hard, his throat tight. Ma. What do we do? She took a slow breath. We fight. The FBI issued their first warning through a bullhorn, the sound echoing through the morning fog like a voice from the sky. Barker Gang. We have you surrounded. Come out with your hands up. The house stayed quiet. This is your only chance. Surrender now. Still nothing got then. A third warning. Last chance. A beat of silence stretched thinner, until it threatened to snap. Inside the house, Ma Barker lifted her rifle. Her hands trembled, not from fear, but from years of strain. She looked at her sons, at the life she had built, the life she had trapped herself inside. She whispered, not to them, not to the agents, but to the walls around her. I ain't going out in chains. Fred moved to the window, muscles tense. Ready when you are. Ma. She nodded once, and then Fred fired the first shot. The sound tore through the fog like lightning, shattering the morning calm. A bullet zipped past an FBI agent, slamming into a tree with a crack for a heartbeat. The world froze. Then the FBI answered back. Gunfire erupted from every direction. A deafening, relentless storm of bullets ripping into the wooden house. Shattered glass flew through the air. Splinters exploded off the walls. The roar of machine guns echoed across the lake like thunder in an empty canyon. Inside. Ma Barker fired back, each shot shaking her small frame. Fred took position beside her, emptying round after round through the windows. Smoke filled the rooms, mixing with dust and the blistering scent of gunpowder. The walls trembled under the relentless barrage. Bullets punched holes through furniture, walls, even the floorboards. But the Barkers didn't fall. Not yet. For hours, yes, hours, the shootout raged. It became one of the longest gun battles in American mob history. The FB, I couldn't believe what they were seeing. Two holding off dozens of armed agents trained for exactly this kind of confrontation. Some called it madness. Some called it defiance. Some called it legendary. Inside the house, Ma Barker moved slower with each passing minute. Fatigue clawed at her. Pain burned through her shoulders. She could barely reload without her fingers shaking. Fred was bleeding from a cut over his eye, but he didn't seem to notice. He was firing on instinct now, rage and fear wrapped tightly around his lungs like barbed wire. Ma, we gotta keep going. He yelled, I know. She shouted back, but deep down, Ma Barker knew the truth. They were at the end. Still, she wouldn't let her boys see her break. She had built her name on strength, on unshakable resolve. She would die with that same iron in her spine. As the hours dragged on. The FBI agents closed in, inch by inch, under constant fire. They shouted commands, tried to breach, tried to return every shot. Eventually, the house was their hideout. Once their sanctuary looked like it had been chewed apart by war. And then came the last burst of gunfire. A final, punishing wave that tore through the walls. Inside. Ma Barker fell back against the bed, her breath leaving her in one quiet exhale. Her rifle slipped from her hands. Fred collapsed near the window. Smoke drifted through the broken rooms. Silence followed. A heavy, suffocating silence that swallowed the last echoes of gunfire. When the agents finally stormed the house, they found Ma Barker and Fred lying their guns still near their hands, courage carved into their final expressions. The legend of Ma Barker had ended. But the story? The story was only just beginning. Because what the world would say next, what history would carve into its memory, would transform this bloody morning into one of the most debated, mythologized, and misunderstood events in American crime history.
The smoke had cleared. The birds returned to the trees around Lake Weir, cautious at first, then gradually louder, chirping as if nothing had happened. The cottage, once a hideout, a sanctuary, a home, now lay in ruins. Shattered windows, splintered walls, charred furniture, and scorched floorboards that told the story more brutally than words ever could. It was over. The siege had ended. Ma Barker and Fred Barker were gone. But the echoes of that final morning would not fade. Not for the FBI, not for the American public, and certainly not for history. The FBI had won, technically. They had brought down two of the most notorious figures in the country at the time. Hoover himself paraded the victory as a monumental step forward for federal authority. Newspapers splashed the story across front pages. FBI kills Ma Barker and son in Florida gun battle. Mother of crime meets her end. The Barker gang's reign of terror ends in flames. The headlines screamed triumph, but beneath the sensationalism, the world sensed something darker, something raw. What was the truth? What had really happened inside that cottage? Inside, the bodies of Ma and Fred lay entwined on the floorboards, a mother and her son bound together in death. Some agents who had stormed the house later claimed Ma fired until the end, that she was a true criminal mastermind. Others insisted she had barely raised her gun, that her role had been more that of a loyal mother who simply refused to leave her son behind. Documents, FBI reports, and testimonies conflicted, and over time, the legend diverged sharply from reality. And the myth grew. In the weeks that followed, the press and the public painted Ma Barker as the devil incarnate, a criminal matriarch who led her sons with an iron fist, orchestrating heists, kidnappings, and murders from the shadows of her small house. Films, radio programs, and dime novels amplified the story, portraying her as a manipulative, ruthless figure, a woman who had single-handedly corrupted her children and terrorized America. But reality was rarely so neat. Friends and family, those who had seen her in quieter moments, whispered a different story. They spoke of a woman who had raised her children in poverty, who had loved fiercely, and who had, in the end, simply refused to abandon the boys she had carried through life. She was a mother who had made terrible choices, yes, but she had done it in the name of loyalty, in the twisted, dangerous language of family love. That loyalty, in the end, had been her undoing. Fred Barker, in particular, had been her pride and her torment. She had watched him grow from a small boy into a man who knew violence as instinctively as most knew kindness. She had enabled him, protected him, perhaps even pushed him down the wrong path. But she had done so with the understanding that family came first. That understanding had shaped her final hours. In death, she had stayed by his side, holding him close, the last act of love she could muster in a life dominated by fear, crime, and survival. The FBI, for their part, treated the victory as a milestone in their national expansion. Hoover claimed the shootout as proof of the Bureau's capability and efficiency, and it was true in the sense that the agents had cornered and eliminated a high-profile target. But in doing so, they had also created a legend, a story far more enduring than any official report or statistical measure of success. Ma Barker had become larger than life. She was no longer just a woman in a cottage. She was an icon of rebellion, of familial devotion, and of the blurred line between criminality and humanity. As the house was cleared, neighbors began to gather. Some came out of curiosity, drawn to the spectacle. Some came to pay respects, though few could reconcile respect with fear. The smell of gunpowder still hung in the air. A few locals whispered rumors, claimed they had seen shadows moving inside the house hours before, swore the Barkers had fired bullets with supernatural skill. Those stories, like the myths that followed, stretched the truth, turning it into something almost cinematic. Beyond the immediate spectacle, the event sent shockwaves through the criminal underworld. Outlaws who had once considered themselves untouchable realized the reach of the federal government had grown, and that defiance now came with a price that could not be escaped. Some retreated further into hiding. Others reconsidered their alliances. And yet, in the darker corners of society, Ma Barker's story became a touchstone, a tale of defiance, courage, and the ferocious protective instinct of a mother, albeit twisted into the language of crime. Historians and criminologists who studied the case decades later began to piece together a more nuanced portrait. Ma Barker was not the mastermind the FBI claimed, nor was she the innocent victim of circumstance. She was something in between, a flawed, human figure whose choices were informed by her environment, by her family, and by a sense of loyalty that would not bend even when faced with death. Her son's fates would also be a cautionary tale. Arthur "Doc" Barker was eventually captured, sentenced, and killed in prison, leaving behind the story of a man whose life had been inseparable from his mother's influence. Fred Barker died in that Florida cottage, an ending violent yet almost poetic in its fidelity to the life he had led, refusing surrender, defending family, embracing death on his own terms. The remaining brothers scattered, trying to escape both law and legend, but their mother's shadow lingered over them, a weight of loyalty and infamy that would never fully lift. As the years passed, Ma Barker's legend only grew. She became a recurring figure in popular culture, a symbol of the ultimate gangster mother, a cautionary tale of devotion and destruction, a reminder of the human face behind the sensational headlines. Writers, filmmakers, and historians debated endlessly about her true role. Some cast her as villain, some as tragic heroine, and some refused to categorize her at all, acknowledging that life, and criminal life, in particular, often defied simple labels. But perhaps the most enduring lesson is this. History remembers the dramatic, the shocking, the vivid. Ma Barker's last stand wasn't just about crime. It was about family, love, loyalty, defiance, and the price of a life lived on the run. Her death, violent and absolute, became the perfect climax for a story that had been unfolding quietly for decades. It was the ending that made the legend immortal, that ensured her name would live on long after the bullets had cooled and the lake had returned to silence. Visitors still come to Lake Weir, even today, drawn by the echoes of that bloody January morning. They peer at the water, at the trees that once framed the cottage, imagining the roar of gunfire, the fear, the courage, the mother and son who refused to surrender. And in that act of remembrance, Ma Barker survives, not just in reports, not just in films, but in the human fascination with stories of love, loyalty, and destruction intertwined. Her life and death offer a dark mirror to anyone who listens. The choices we make, the people we love, and the forces we align ourselves with can elevate us to legendary status, or drag us into infamy. She is remembered as both, a monster and a mother, a criminal and a caretaker, a figure who defied easy explanation. The FBI may have claimed victory, but the story was never theirs alone. Ma Barker's last stand became a symbol, a legend woven into the fabric of American crime history. It reminds us that every headline hides a human story, that every villain carries echoes of love, and that sometimes the fiercest battles are fought not just with weapons, but with the bonds of family, the choices of the heart, and the loyalty that defines us even in the face of inevitable destruction. And so the legend of Ma Barker persists, fierce, haunting, unforgettable. A mother who loved too much, who lived dangerously, who died with her son by her side, leaving behind a story that continues to captivate, shock, and inspire. Her cottage may have crumbled, her body may have fallen, and her bullets may have ceased. But the story, the myth, the human drama lives on forever. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe for more tales from the shadows of history. Dive into the darkness, follow the legends, and witness the lives that shaped America's criminal underworld, one story at a time.